All right, so in this demonstration, I'm going to go over the 5 different techniques that we're going to be using, eventually incorporating those into our first actual painting. So this is just sort of the 3 practice things that I want you to work on first. So I've got all my materials. I've got my containers of water halfway full, my little tray lids. I've got like a rag here, and I've got a paper towel to wipe off brushes and the trays. And of course, I've got my paints, my brush, and I've got my paper set up with all 5 of these things that we're going to practice. And so we're going to be practicing them twice. All right, so we're going to do dry brush first, then wet on dry, wet on wet, salt, and masking. So I also have my salt container over here, and I've got 2 different kinds of masking tape. If you've got the blue, that'll work the best, but the tan kind of color here, vanilla color, will work pretty well as well. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start with dry brush. So pick any color, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to go ahead in here and activate. I'll use this violet because I was using this before. Okay. So you can kind of go light or dark, whatever value you want. And then I'm just kind of going to get my brush a little on the dry side. So I'm just going to take a cloth, kind of wipe it off. Then I'm going to go back and get a little bit more pigment on it. And my dry brush, okay, ends up looking like this, where I can see the strokes in here. Okay, I can see where the bristles, I come back in here, I could do a little bit more. Okay, where there's some like marks and there's some gaps between the areas in here. So that's where your brush, you've gotten your color in your palette. You know, you dried off your brush on your towel, and then you've gone back in and you've taken it into just the paint here, and just on your little palette, mixing palette, and just gone in like this. Okay, so that is your dry brush. Now the wet on wet sounds, the wet on dry, okay, well the dry is our paper. That's kind of your typical brush stroke with the watercolor, more or less. All right, so I'm going to choose this color this time. And again, careful when you get because you want to make sure that you wipe off those little droplets on the metal part, the shaft of the brush. Otherwise, they'll drip on your watercolor and you'll make a spot. Okay, so I haven't dried my brush off. It's nice and wet from my color here. It's not dripping. And I just have my nice marks or chunks of color in here, where I've got no gaps, sort of nicely filling in here. And it feels a lot like if you were using a marker. And that is my wet on dry. Feel free to make some different marks, play around with it a little bit, but you can definitely see the difference between the 2. Okay, now my wet on wet. So dry was the dry of the paper, and wet is going to be the wet of the paper. Now this is sort of your test of what your paper is capable of doing in terms of how much water it can withstand. So your sketchbook paper is 80 pounds, so that's 80 pounds of pressure that was applied to the fibers to make the paper in the first place. So the higher the poundage of your paper, the thicker and more resilient it is to water. So like watercolor paper typically starts around 200, usually up to 400 or 600 pounds, where it gets really sort of stiff and there's a lot of tooth to it and a kind of a waviness to it, where you can really do a lot to that paper. Okay. All right, so wet on wet. So I'm going to start with just my water. Scrape off a little bit here. And I'm just going to kind of do a little water washing area there. And then immediately I'm going to go in and I'm going to get color. Maybe I'll just use that for my palette, and I'm going to go in here like so. And you can see it starts to sort of bleed in, that wet on wet effect. And my colors are a little bit on the light side, so let me get some darker stuff in here. So I'm going to try it again in another spot. So I'm going to rinse, because you want to dry, because you're starting off with just the water. You're trying to get an area that you're going to have this nice flowing area of color. Okay, and how that really sort of flows. And something else that's cool with this is when I do that, then I can come back in with another color. So I'm going to take a little red here. And I can kind of how that blends in together. And, you know, play around with it. Say, oh, I'm going to try a little yellow over here, see what that looks like. So it's still pretty wet. I'm going to grab a little yellow. Get that wet a little bit. There we go. Where you've got these really great little spots in here where the pigment is suspended in the water and it's just moving around all over the place, where there's this really great blending that's happening. Okay, and a lot of times what you can do with wet on wet, it's like you can start out, that's a lot of water, we don't want that much, but that's okay. And I got my blue. Okay, and then add a little more blue. Okay, now you'll notice that's a lot of swirling. That's sort of too much water. We don't want that much water. Okay, we want it to wet, but we don't want it like a lake. And then I'm going to go in, add a little red here. Whoops. Okay. And then I'm just going to mix it on the paper. Okay, then maybe I want a little bit more of a violet going on there. And then I'm going to kind of mix that. Okay, and then maybe I want a little something, this one on top of that one. I'm going to wiggle that around in there. So I've got this, and then maybe I want some more red over here. So with the wet on wet, like, have some fun with it, play around, really see kind of what cool things that you can do with those colors as they sort of weave in and out and flow together. Okay? All right, so this one's a fun one. So a little bit like wet on wet. Oops, I just washed off my brush in the wrong bucket. That's okay. So I'm going to scrape that off. We don't want that too wet. And I'm going to just... You don't have to do wet on wet. You can do wet on dry too. Whoops, that bled a little bit. That's one of the things we got to watch out with watercolors. That's why we have to paint for a while, and then we have to stop, because if you paint right next to an area you just painted, what's going to happen is you're going to get this bleed through. But it's okay for our example piece. All right, so I'm going to choose this green over here this time. Okay, so I've got this nice little green over here. All right, now while this is wet, it's good and wet. So let me brush aside. I'm going to get my salt. I'm just going to take a little bit. I'm just going to sprinkle it on over here. Okay, sprinkle a little bit more over here. And you can start to see the granules. Okay, where it's picking up the pigment. All right, I'm going to do it again around the other side. You can see it again. So let's see. I'll do a red this time. I got my red. I'm going to get a little bit more water on it this time. Make that pretty wet. Even a little bit more than I probably should. So that's pretty soupy. And again, take my salt. And I spread it on there, and you can instantly see that the salt, the watercolor there that I painted is getting drawn into that salt. So what's going to happen is that these are going to be little lighter chunks. So you're going to end up with this really cool texture. Okay, this little model texture in here that you can do kind of all kinds of fun stuff. So I could actually even go back, like if I did it over here to this one here, because I've got some cool stuff. Okay, but if your paper's too dry already, you can see in here where it's just sort of sitting, the granules are sitting on top of there. It's not really doing anything, but it is pulling from in this way. And so tomorrow, when we take this, we can actually brush this salt completely off, and we'll be left with these little chunks that kind of removed the paint a little bit. All right, masking. So masking, we need to make sure this is dry. Okay, and I'm going to get some masking tape, and we're just blocking out areas that we don't want the paint to go. So you could tear this, you could cut this, like I've got like a little, my scissors over here, cutting some little strips. And if you get it thin enough, you can start to curve it a little bit. I'll cut another strip here. You know, you can try cutting some shapes out. And again, the other kind of tape works pretty well too. But this is the painter's tape, so this really does a good job coming off the paper. And then maybe I'll put this one here, like so. Really get that on there. And then I just go back to my colors. Maybe I'll get a nice, I'll do this violet over here. And you're just going to put a wash like straight over the top of this. Okay, so I can just kind of paint that straight over the top. Maybe I want to do a little wet on wet just because I thought that was really cool. You can kind of play around. So then maybe I'll add a little red in there. Just because that was pretty cool, just to see what that does. Okay, and tomorrow, or in a couple hours, when this is totally dry, I can peel this tape off, and then you're going to be left with the white of the page. And you can also mask where you could do like a color. You could do lots of these in combinations where you could do like a wet on wet, and then you can go and you can put some salt on it, and then let that dry, dust it off, and then you can go mask over the top of that, put some other colors down, maybe do some dry brushing on top of that, and then you can peel this off, and you're left with that original, those original color combinations that you came up with. So we've got our dry brush, our wet on dry paper, our wet on our wet paper, our salts in our color areas, and we have our masking.